All right, so in this one, we are going to be starting the checkout process for our shopping cart. Now, the checkout process is going to exist outside of the cart itself, so it's not actually going to be on here. It's going to be in a completely separate area. In fact, it's going to be on a whole URL called checkout. So let's go ahead and get this started. First off, we're going to jump into our views.py inside of the carts model, and we're just going to put it right underneath this. And I want to call it, I'm going to give it a class, of course, and it's going to be checkout view. And we're going to use a detail view on this one instead of the single object mixin and view, which you could use a detail view up here as well. It wouldn't do a whole lot different, but let's go ahead and import the detail view itself right up here with the single object mixin, detail view, checkout view is detail view. And the object itself, or the model itself, is going to be cart, just like our cart view. And then the template name is going to be carts slash checkout view.html. We don't want it to be checkout detail because that's not exactly what we're doing. So we're going to call it the checkout view. And then to get the cart itself, we want to copy this get object or something very, very similar to it and paste it in here. So the get object, well, we don't need to set the expiration. Definitely don't need to do that, but we do need to get the cart ID. And if it's none, we're not going to create a new cart. Instead, we're going to return redirect to the cart itself. So we want it to go back to the cart if it's not there. So let's import that redirect function. So if the cart ID doesn't exist, if there's no cart in the session, then we're going to just send them back to the cart. Create the cart, and they'd be able to do all that stuff. But since there will be a cart, we have the cart ID here, and this is all going to work just fine. Request that user is authenticated. We're going to get rid of this. So the object itself is just this cart. So let's go ahead and put this cart view into our URLs. So inside of our project URLs, we are going to import the checkout view. And just down below here, we'll do URL r caret, and we're just going to call it checkout, $sign at the end, checkout view as view, and the name is checkout. All right, so now let's go ahead and look at our checkout, refresh in here, giving us the template does not exist as expected. So we'll go back into our carts template and we'll do checkout view.html. And it's going to extend from the base, so extends base.html, kind of the standard stuff, block content, and end block. All right, so now we have to think about what's going on with this checkout view. Now, first of all, they shouldn't be able to continue with the checkout if they're not logged in or at least continuing as a guest. So let's make sure that we do that in our context object. So I'll do diff get context data, and it's going to take in self, args, and keyword args. Context is equal to super checkout view self dot get context data, and then it takes in the args and the keyword args. So if the self.request.user is authenticated, then we'll do something. Well, in fact, we'll say if it's not authenticated, then we'll just say context user auth equals to false, and we'll return the context. I'll explain why we're doing this in the first place in a moment. So back into our view, we're going to put user auth in here. So we'll refresh and say false. The user is not logged in, as we see up here. So there's one more thing that we want to consider here is or if user request user is guest, something like that, which is not going to have a function of guest, so we have invalid syntax here, so we're just going to comment that out for now. So if it's the guest, then we're going to show some data, if they're authenticated or they're the guest, it's not going to show the same data that we're about to work with. So we're going to work on this not authenticated part first. So that means we want to import the login form that we actually use. So if you go into our login form, let's say for instance we put a wrong password in, this login form is actually what we want to render, but we're going to render it here on this checkout. So to do this, we first off need to import that form. And this is a default form that comes in with Django. It's an authentication form. So this is their default authentication form that we're actually going to be working with. Now, the only reason we're using the default Django form is because Django Registration Redux also uses that same form for login. So that login page that we just were at, this login page is coming from Django Registration Redux. That's actually handling the view, but the form itself is coming from Django. And you can find that out by going through the code, the Django Registration Redux code, but we're just going to go off of this. So let's go ahead and import this authentication form. It's from django.contrib.auth.forms, import authentication form. So I'm going to scroll down, and now in context, we'll do context, and we'll say login form is equal to this authentication form, and we want to make an instance of it, so we'll actually create that instance. And now back into our checkout view, we'll put login form. And what we see now is username and password. Cool, so we can do the Crispy data stuff, so load Crispy forms tags and turn this form into Crispy. So if we refresh, now we have our username and password. So we also are going to want to have, well, let's create the form itself. So form method equals to post action. We'll talk about this in a second. And then the CSRF token. Close off the form. And put the input type of submit. Class equals to BTN and BTN success. And then value, we'll say login. Close that out. If we refresh in here, cool. So now we have this login form. So the action itself, we don't want it to go to the same URL we are in. We want it to go to the URL where the authentication actually happens. So that URL, well, if we needed to reference it, we could go back down into our registration templates, into login. And ideally, we would say, oh, cool, it's actually here. But it's actually not showing us the correct URL here. So let's look at the registration form because we used the same login for it, and it says auth login. So where the login is actually being generated is also the same place that the link for login is going to be. So that's where we want to use. This URL auth login is what we want to use for action. So then it actually sends this form data to that URL. All right, so that's important. And then on our login view, we also might want to have our register. We could have our register and forgot password stuff in here as well. And going back into our checkout view, I'll just put it in here right underneath the form and put it into p tags. And we'll say class equals to text center. All right, so if we refresh in here, we don't have the trans block. Let's go back in here and just load it in. There we go. So we've got all this stuff, and text center is not exactly working, but we'll worry about that later. All right, so now that we've got this, let's go ahead and create this form and have it show up here on the right. And we'll say div class equals to column small 6. And since it's column small 6, we might as well put another one in here. And this is for the guest checkout, and I'll just say p class equals to lead, and we'll say guest, or continue as guest, which will basically mean that we want to get a email from them. So they'll have to put their email address in to actually do this. And then over here, we'll just say login to continue. There we go. So we have the two things, this user auth login, we'll say if user auth login, if not user auth. and if. All right, so there we go. We've got our continue as guest and login to continue. Now if I hit login here, assuming of course you actually logged in with the right password, it takes me to this home page, which is not really where I want it to go. I want it to go back to the checkout as soon as I log in, and obviously this stuff shouldn't appear either. So to do this, we'll set up our next URL call, and I'll say input type equals to hidden, and we'll say name equals to next, and the value, we are going to give it a context data of next URL. And to get this, or to set this, I should say, we're going to go back into our view, and we're going to set it in here. And we'll say next URL equals to self.request.build absolute URI. So now if we refresh in here, let's log out and come back to checkout. Let's see what's going on because the submit button is not showing up. So let's go back into our view and see why. Oh, we need to close off this next URL, the hidden element here. And now if I log in, it takes me right back to the checkout. So that's what's important about that next URL stuff. Cool. So since we have that, let's go ahead and update our actual template here. So back into our views, I'm going to say instead of this, we'll say user auth is a variable. So user auth equals to false. So the user is not authenticated. And instead of doing this, we'll say if self.request.user.is authenticated, and then or if request user.is guest, which we'll have to figure out a method for that. Then we'll say user auth equals to true. Let's make this a little bit more explicit. So user can continue. And there we go. So now user can continue. We want to put that into our context either way. So back into our template, if not user can continue, then it's going to show us that stuff. We've got an error here, but if the user can't continue, then it's going to show us the login stuff. And if we go back into our views, let's see what's going on. It's at 144, there's an error. We need a colon there because we still are going to put these guest stuff in there at some point. All right, so now if I refresh, I see this checkout is now showing this. So let's go back in, create a shopping cart, add to cart, and then we can just jump straight to checkout. And it's telling me to continue. I log in and I'm inside of checkout. Cool. All right, so if any questions on how we built this checkout view and what we did here, let us know. Otherwise, let's keep going.